there's a moment in season 3 I keep coming back to. Not a battle, not a death, something quieter. Rick stands at a sink, washing blood from his hands. Routine by now. But there's something in the way he stares at them, like they belong to someone else. Then he says it, almost offhand. I'm not your governor. I'm not the governor of anything. Like a refusal. But what if it's really an admission? The group calls him their leader. He never once calls himself one. He keeps washing. The blood, the weight, the question. None of it leaves. So tonight, let's follow that thread together. Through the seasons, through the spin-offs, through everything the show built and quietly reconsidered. Because I think this universe has been asking one question all along, and we were too caught up to notice. What if Rick Grimes was never the hero at all? Think about the very first image we ever get of Rick Grimes. He's not surrounded by people who trust him. He's not delivering a speech. He wakes up alone in a hospital bed, disoriented, confused, wearing the clothes of a man who almost died. The world outside has ended, and he has no idea. He doesn't know about Laurie. He doesn't know about Carl. He doesn't know that his old partner, his closest friend, stepped into the silence he left and did what needed doing. He just wakes up, grabs the things that marked who he was before, including that sheriff's badge, and walks out into the apocalypse, carrying a symbol of authority that nobody voted for and nobody asked for. That's in the very first episode. That detail, the badge, is easy to overlook. It's familiar, even comforting. A sheriff is supposed to protect people. A sheriff is supposed to have order and law on his side. But here's the thing worth sitting with. The badge is a pre-apocalypse credential. It's a marker of who Rick was inside a system that no longer exists. And yet he keeps it. Not just in the pilot, he keeps it for years. There's never a scene where Rick quietly sets it down, acknowledges that the old world's authority means nothing now, and earns something new in its place. The badge just travels with him, unchallenged like a habit. Now contrast that with Shane. When we catch up with Shane in those early season 1 episodes, he has already adapted. He made the brutal call to get the survivors moving when Rick was still unconscious in that hospital. He was the one holding the group together through the initial chaos, through the Atlanta camp, through the fire and the fear. Shane didn't wait for a system to validate him. He looked at the situation and acted, and the group followed. Not because of a symbol he carried, but because he moved when they couldn't. What's interesting about those early episodes isn't just what Rick does, it's what he doesn't do. He arrives, and the group sort of absorbs him back. There's relief, yes, but it's complicated. Nobody sits down and says, Rick, you are our leader now. The assumption just forms around him, quietly, like fog. And part of that is the badge. Part of that is the gun. Part of that is the simple fact that he projected authority because authority used to be his job. But projection isn't leadership. And the show, if you watch carefully, already knows the difference. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating about this. The Walking Dead is a story that asks over and over again, what does legitimate authority look like when civilization is gone? Who deserves to lead, and why? And in its very first episode, it places us beside a man who stepped into leadership not because he was chosen, but because the role was familiar and the void was available. That's not a criticism of Rick as a person. It's a structural observation about how power actually forms, not through wisdom or election, but through proximity and habit. The badge in this reading is our first motif. Not a symbol of heroism, but of inherited authority. Rick doesn't earn it in the new world. He carries it in from the old one. And the show lets him. We let him. Because we were raised on stories where the badge means something, where the person wearing the star is the good one by default, and that instinct runs deep, even when the world that made the badge is ash. I keep thinking about how different those first episodes feel when you approach them with that question already in mind. The group doesn't choose Rick, they default to him. And there's a difference. A choice implies deliberation, assessment, something earned. A default implies a gap, a hesitation, a moment where someone familiar steps into a space nobody else claimed. Rick stepped into that space, and we followed him there willingly, without asking who gave him the right. That's where our theory begins, not with a crime, not with a betrayal, but with a very quiet question. Who gave Rick Grimes permission to lead? And we did none of us ask until it was much too late. If Rick is a mirror, reflecting what the group needed to see in a leader, then Shane is the thing the mirror was hiding. Shane Walsh is, I'd argue, one of the most honest characters The Walking Dead ever wrote. Not because he was good, he wasn't always good, but because he never pretended. He didn't hide the cost of survival behind a moral framework he couldn't actually afford to live inside. He looked at the situation, made the call, and lived with the fallout without asking for absolution. Take what happened with Laurie. During those early months, when the world was ending and Rick was gone, assumed dead, probably dead, Shane was there. He helped keep Carl alive. He helped keep the camp running. And yes, he and Laurie became something more. It's uncomfortable to watch in retrospect because we know Rick comes back. But in the moment, in that world, Shane was making human choices under impossible pressure. When the truth came out, Laurie said it plainly in season 2. I know what I did wasn't right. She wasn't absolved. Shane wasn't absolved. But at least the show acknowledged the cost directly. Rick's moral position, by contrast, was often cushioned. He got to arrive at conclusions that others had already paid for. Shane cleared the moral ground, and Rick walked in behind him. That's not a dramatic exaggeration. You can trace it episode by episode. In season 1, Shane's the one who kept the survivors alive long enough for Rick to rejoin them. In season 2 on Herschel's farm, Shane's the one who sees the reality of the barn, who pushes against the comfortable fiction they're all maintaining. He's not kind about it. He's not gentle. But he's right. And when the barn is opened and Sophia walks out, already turned, already gone, that horror lands hardest on Rick. But it was Shane who saw it coming. Here's the pattern the showrunners established early and kept returning to throughout the series. Shane externalizes everything Rick internally suppresses. The rage, the ruthlessness, the willingness to act without the sanction of the group's moral comfort. Rick has those qualities too. We'll see them surface more and more as the seasons go on. But for a long time, Shane carried them openly so Rick didn't have to. It was, in narrative terms, a kind of outsourcing. Rick's conscience stayed clean while Shane absorbed the cost. And then Rick killed him. In the season 2 finale, Rick drives a knife into Shane in a field, and it's framed as necessity. Shane were going to kill him first. The situation had escalated beyond recovery. That's all true, canonically. But it's also worth sitting with the fact that Rick was the one who led Shane out into that field. He made a choice there. He could have tried other things. He chose not to. And then when Carl shot the reanimated Shane to protect his father, Rick stood in the dark and absorbed it all, including the silence where his best friend used to be. The showrunners never let Rick fully reckon with what Shane's death cost him. We see grief, yes, we see it crater into something worse in season 3. But the moral interrogation, the real questioning of whether Rick's model of leadership actually served the people around him, that keeps getting deferred. as if the show loved Rick too much to ask it directly, or as if it was saving that question for much later. For the spin-offs, for the universe that had to keep running after Rick was gone. Some fans have pointed out that Shane's logic, his blunt survival calculus, keeps reasserting itself throughout the series in different characters. First, Rick himself adopts it. Then Negan weaponizes it. Then Daryl internalizes a more restrained version. It's as if the show couldn't let Shane's worldview die even after it killed Shane. His ghost hangs over the entire franchise, and I think that's intentional. Because the question Shane asked, can you afford to be good and still survive, never really gets answered. It just gets asked in new voices, by new people, in new places. And every time, we watch to see if this time the answer will be different. And that's where the thread starts to pull a little tighter. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes when the person everyone is counting on simply can't do it anymore. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask permission. It just arrives, and suddenly the person who was holding everything together is somewhere else. Present in body. Absent in everything that matters. That's what we're watching in season 3, after Laurie dies, and it's one of the most important, quietly devastating stretches of the entire show. Not because of what Rick does, but because of what he stops being able to do. Laurie dies during childbirth. Maggie delivers the baby. Carl makes the final choice that no child should ever have to make. And Rick, standing in that prison corridor, goes somewhere the group can't follow. He collapses, he screams, and then over the episodes that follow, he starts receiving phone calls from Laurie, from Jim, from Jackie, from Amy. Voices of the dead calling from somewhere beyond, offering something his grief needs. The sound of people who aren't gone yet in his mind. The show frames this carefully. It doesn't immediately tell us the calls aren't real. It lets us sit in Rick's experience for a while, lets us feel the warmth of those voices the way he does. And then it slowly, gently reveals what we suspected. There's nobody on the other end. It's Rick alone, talking to the silence. Here's what I want to sit with for a moment. During this stretch, this weeks-long arc of grief and hallucination, the prison nearly falls. The governor is circling. The group is making decisions without their leader, and not always wisely. They need Rick. And Rick isn't there, not really. He's present the way a lamp is present when the power is out. The shape is right, but there's nothing inside it. The emotional weight of this moment is real, and it's meant to be. We're supposed to feel the cost of loss, the way grief can hollow a person out completely. Rick's pain here is human and recognizable and deeply sympathetic. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But let's hold the two things at once, the way the show asks us to. Rick's grief is real, and his absence has consequences that real people bear. That phone, the prop, the object, is our motif for this chapter. It appears in season 3, when Rick first picks it up and hears a voice he thinks he recognizes. It becomes something both hopeful and heartbreaking, a communication device repurposed for isolation. Rick isn't reaching out to the living. He's reaching in toward the dead, because the living are too complicated, too needy, too real. The phone is the symbol of the gap between the person the group needs and the person grief has made him. And what fills that gap while Rick is on the phone? Daryl, Herschel, Maggie, Carol. The people who actually kept the prison running, who made the supply runs, who kept the watch, who held frightened people's hands and made hard calls without fanfare. They don't get the credit Rick gets. They rarely get the close-up, but they're doing the work. This is a pattern the show returns to repeatedly, and it's worth naming clearly. Leadership in The Walking Dead is often performed by the people around Rick, while Rick is managing something internal. His crises, and he has many, and they're valid, create openings that others fill, and those others, by filling them, become the actual infrastructure of the group's survival. They just do it without the title. The phone also foreshadows something worth remembering much later. Communication in this universe is always layered. There's what's said, there's what's heard, and there's the silence in between, which carries its own kind of meaning. Rick calling the dead and hearing voices that aren't there is an early version of a theme the show will return to. The difference between the story we tell about ourselves and the reality others are actually living. What does it mean that the hero checked out exactly when the people around him needed him most? Maybe it means the wait was always going to be too much for one person. Maybe it means something the show has been quietly building toward all along. That the real structure of survival was never Rick. It was always the people standing next to him. And tonight, that's the thread we're going to keep pulling. There is a moment in the season 4 finale that changes something fundamental about how we watch Rick Grimes. It's not subtle, it's visceral. A man named Joe, leader of a brutal group called the Claimers, has Rick pinned down. Joe is going to kill him. And in the struggle, with Daryl held back, Carl terrified, Michonne restrained, Rick does something that no one watching could quite process in the moment. He lunges forward and bites out Joe's throat with his teeth. Joe falls. Rick spits. The immediate crisis is over. The group's reaction is what matters here. They don't recoil. They don't stare at Rick in horror, in the way you might expect someone to respond to watching another human being use methods indistinguishable from a walker's. Daryl is relieved. Michonne holds on to Carl. The danger has passed, and in the immediate aftermath, Rick sits in the road, covered in blood, hands shaking, staring at what he's become. And none of them walk away. They're screwing with the wrong people. He says this later in the episode, after they're locked in the train car at Terminus, surrounded by what we'll soon learn is a community built on cannibalism. It's a line that lands as defiant, even thrilling. And that response from the audience is worth noticing. Because by season 4, the show has trained us to hear Rick's violence as reassurance, not as alarm, as protection. What would you have felt in that moment? Relief, probably. The same relief the group felt. And I'd gently suggest that relief is also a little bit of the problem. Think about the arc of Rick's violence across the seasons. In season 1, he shoots a little girl who has turned hesitantly, agonizingly. In season 2, he wrestles with what to do about Randall, reversing course more than once. Each escalation is justified. Each step further from the moral standard he started with is wrapped in enough context that we accept it. The show is patient and careful about this. It doesn't suddenly turn Rick into something monstrous. It inches the line. And by season 4, we're at the throat-biting scene, and we're not flinching anymore. The claimed arc, the episodes leading up to the Terminus finale, where Rick hides under a bed while one of the claimers is killed in the same house, offers another piece of this. Rick watches a man die, makes the call not to intervene, slips out a window and moves on. It's pragmatic. It keeps him and Michonne and Carl alive. But it's also the kind of choice that the Rick of season 1 might have struggled with considerably longer. By season 4, the calculation is faster. The mercy window is narrower. And the show doesn't editorialize, it just lets it be. This is one of the most honest and underappreciated things The Walking Dead does. It doesn't tell us Rick has changed. It shows us, incrementally, in the texture of his choices. And it trusts us to keep up. The pattern is, Rick does the thing. It works. We move on, but the accumulation of those moments is quietly rewriting who he is, one necessity at a time. The right hand is always in the frame, reaching, striking, wiping clean. The same hand that touched Carl's hair is the one Joe died on. The show doesn't make us choose between those two facts. It just holds them both up and waits. Here's the question worth taking with you. If the audience's relief at Rick's violence is the whole point, what does that make us? Not in a dark, accusatory way, but genuinely. We were frightened, and then Rick acted, and we felt better. That's a specific kind of storytelling. It uses our own survival instincts against our moral judgment, making us complicit in a slide we might object to in any other context. The show earned that. It was doing something deliberate, asking whether we, the audience, are really so different from the characters who follow Rick without questioning him. By season 4, Rick isn't the man who woke up in that hospital, Keeney. He's something the apocalypse shaped. And he's bringing the people he loves along with him. The question the show's beginning to ask quietly, even here, is whether the direction he's leading them is actually good, or whether it's just effective. Those aren't the same thing. And that distinction is about to cost everyone very dearly. One episode, one of the most devastating hours of television The Walking Dead ever produced, and Rick isn't in it. The Grove, Season 4, Episode 14, is the story of Carol, Tyrese, Lizzie, Mika and baby Judith walking through the Georgia countryside after the prison falls. It's a story about the cost of kindness in a world that punishes it, about what happens when a child's understanding of the new reality is fundamentally, irreparably broken. Lizzie doesn't understand that walkers are gone. Not different, gone. And by the end of the episode, Carol has to make the hardest call the show has ever asked of a character. She kills Lizzie, gently, in a field full of wildflowers. Rick is nowhere near this moment. He's somewhere else, recovering, travelling, managing his own separate crisis. And Carol does what needs doing because someone has to, because the alternative is more death, because the world does not pause for the right person to arrive and authorise the decision. She carries it alone, and the weight of it is visible in every episode that follows. Here's what makes this so relevant to our theory. Carol was exiled by Rick. Earlier in season 4, after Rick learned what Carol had done at the prison, killing Karen and David to stop a flu outbreak from spreading, he made the unilateral call to send her away. He told her she couldn't come back. He told a group afterward, and they were troubled, but Rick had decided. And then when the prison fell, when the group scattered, when everything Rick had built came apart, Carol was the one who showed up to help Tyrese. Carol was the one who kept Judith alive. Carol was the one who made the impossible call in that field. The cycle here is worth sitting with. Rick exiles Carol for making a hard call without his permission. Carol goes on to make an even harder call, alone without anyone's permission because survival required it. And later, when Rick and Carol are reunited in season 5 at Alexandria, the exile is just over. She's back. She's needed. The thing he punished her for is quietly reframed as the quality that makes her indispensable. I'm not suggesting Rick was wrong to be troubled by what Carol did. The moral weight of choosing to kill sick people to protect the healthy is genuinely complicated, and reasonable survivors can disagree. But the structural pattern is revealing. Rick controls who is in and who is out, based on his moral framework, and the people he pushes out turn out to be the ones doing the work his framework can't accommodate. They don't stop being necessary just because he stopped wanting to look at them. Think about how many of Rick's clean hands moments exist because someone else got their hands dirty first. Shane cleared the way. Carol cleared the way. Daryl cleared the way. Again and again. The show gives Rick the moral high ground, but it also quietly plants the evidence that the high ground was built by people he never fully credited. Could the group have survived without those people doing the things Rick wouldn't sanction? The evidence is that they couldn't. And yet the credit flows differently. There's a scene in the early Alexandria arc, Season 5, after Carol has rejoined the group, where she's playing the role of a harmless housewife, baking cookies, smiling at neighbours, making herself invisible. It's one of the most unsettling performances in the series, because we know what Carol is capable of. She's not hiding weakness, she's hiding strength, because strength in Rick's world has always had to justify itself to him before it was allowed to act. What would you do in Carol's position? Exiled by the person you trusted, forced to survive alone, and then welcomed back when your skills were convenient again? Would you hold on to the resentment? Or would you set it aside and keep going? Because the alternative is stopping. And in this world, stopping means dying. Carol chooses to keep going every time. And every time she does, the show asks us quietly whether the people who make that choice are stronger than the people who lead, or whether they're just less valued. How many of Rick's clean hands moments were borrowed from someone else's sacrifice? I think the answer is more than we ever counted. And the counting's part of what's going to bring this whole theory into focus. Alexandria should have been a relief. And in some ways it was. Clean houses, running water at least for a while. Walls. People who had managed to hold something together when everything else was coming apart. After the prison fell, after the road, after Terminus and everything that name came to mean. The group arrived in Alexandria in Season 5, and the contrast was almost disorienting. Real beds, cooked food, neighbours who still use their indoor voices. But watch how it unfolds. Watch what happens as Rick and his people settle in. The Alexandrians had survived, yes, but they'd survived in a kind of protected bubble, cautious, organised, not particularly hardened by direct contact with how brutal the world beyond the walls had become. They had structure, but they had soft edges. And into this community walks Rick Grimes with his group, wearing several months of road survival on their faces, carrying a way of looking at the world that Alexandria wasn't built for. There is a specific scene in late Season 5 that I think is more important than it's usually given credit for. Rick, after a series of escalating tensions with the Alexandrians, ends up at a community gathering where he delivers what is functionally an ultimatum. He stands in front of these people, their community, their home, their structure, and tells them essentially that things are going to have to change. And then he produces a gun. He raises it, not at anyone in particular, but at the room, at the situation, at the uncertainty. It's a gesture meant to communicate seriousness, but what it actually communicates to the Alexandrians watching is something closer to threat. Deanna Monroe, who led Alexandria with genuine intelligence and care, responds with something that cuts through the moment. You people. 2 words. It's not rage, it's quiet assessment. The kind that comes from someone watching a force she invited in begin to reshape the space around her, and not entirely for the better. Deanna was not naive, she was perceptive, and she saw exactly what Rick's arrival meant for the things she'd built. The communities in The Walking Dead have a pattern around Rick's arrival. Think about it. The Atlanta camp, lost in fire. The farm which the group stayed at, and which ended in catastrophe. The prison which Rick chose and built, and which fell to the governor. Alexandria, which Rick entered, and within 1 season nearly took over by force. communities that the group touched and changed, not always with the community's full consent, not always for the better in the short term. To be fair, and fairness matters here, many of these falls had other causes. The governor destroyed the prison. Negan terrorized the hilltop and the kingdom. The world outside was genuinely, persistently dangerous, and Rick's instinct to harden the people around him wasn't wrong. But the pattern is still worth sitting with. Wherever Rick goes, the existing structure bends around him. Not because he's malicious, because he's certain. The right hand appears again here as our motif. In the Alexandria scenes, Rick's right hand is constantly in motion, gesturing control, claiming space, producing weapons. It's the hand of a man fluent in the language of command, and it speaks that language even when the situation is asking for something quieter. His body knows how to lead. What it's still learning is how to simply belong. Deanna saw it. Some of the Alexandrians saw it. And some of the fans watching most carefully saw it too. A version of Rick that wasn't just protecting people, but also consolidating. A leader who needed, on some level, to be the one who decided. Not out of malice, out of habit. Out of the deep-wired belief that his judgment was the variable that kept people alive. That belief had been reinforced, season after season, often correctly. But correctness isn't the same as rightness. And the gap between those two things is where the most interesting questions live. Here's what I find genuinely compelling about this stretch of the show. Alexandria doesn't collapse because Rick is bad. It bends because of the collision between two survival philosophies. The Alexandrians' careful, somewhat insular approach, and Rick's harder, more aggressive model. Both have merit. Both have cost. And the show doesn't entirely take a side. It just lets the collision happen and watches what survives. What does it say that every safe community Rick enters eventually stops feeling safe? That's the quiet question underneath everything, and we're getting closer to an answer. There's a before and after in The Walking Dead that happens in a field, in the dark in the Season 7 premiere. Before that field, the show was about finding a way to survive together. After that field, it was about what survival costs when the price is paid in the people you love most. Negan kills Glenn. He kills Abraham. He does it methodically, in front of everyone. Carefully, deliberately, as a demonstration. Not just of his power, but of the limits of Rick's. Because up to that point, no villain had ever broken Rick the way Negan does in that premiere. Not the governor, not Gareth, not Joe in the Claimers. Negan kneels Rick down in the dirt and makes him feel small, and the camera stays on Rick's face while it happens, and we feel it too. Here's the question worth sitting with, though. How did they end up in that field? The confrontation with the Saviours wasn't something that happened to Rick. He chose it. After arriving at Alexandria, after connecting with the hilltop, after learning about Negan's network through Gregory, Rick made a decision. They would strike the Saviours before the Saviours came to them. He took a team, including Daryl, Glenn, Maggie and others, to raid one of the Saviours' outposts. They killed a lot of people who were sleeping, people who hadn't been part of whatever calculation justified the attack in Rick's mind. The retaliation, when it came, was Negan and that field. Glenn Rhee is dead because of a chain of decisions that Rick set in motion. Abraham Ford is dead for the same reason. Sasha Williams will die before the war is over. The kingdom will lose dozens of fighters. The hilltop will fracture. Alexandria will nearly be destroyed. And throughout all of it, there is a persistent question that Maggie Rhee carries in her grief, visible in every choice she makes across seasons 7 and 8. Was this worth it? Was this Rick's war? or the group's war? If it was Rick's war, which structurally it was because he initiated it, then who gets to reckon with that? Maggie does, actually. She reckons with it quietly and slowly, across years. We see it in Dead City, long after the dust has settled, where she's still carrying the weight of Glenn's death and still making impossible calls in impossible situations. Her arc becomes, over time, one of the show's most honest explorations of what leadership costs. Because she didn't start as a leader, and she didn't claim it the way Rick did, for mind. She grew into it painfully, out of necessity, out of grief, out of the absence Glenn's death left. Her leadership was built from loss, not from authority. The war itself is, structurally, Rick's war. He starts it. He expands it. He makes alliances without fully consulting the communities those alliances commit to the fight. He holds strategy close and delegates the suffering broadly. And when Carl is shot, the wound that will eventually kill him. During the Season 8 battle, the war's cost arrives in the most personal, irreversible way possible. As if the story has its own kind of accounting. Something worth noticing about Rick's leadership during the war. He's decisive, forceful, often tactically right, but he's also frequently alone in the decision-making and frequently surprised by consequences he thought he'd fully calculated. Daryl breaks from the plan at a critical moment. Things don't unfold the way Rick mapped them. The gap between the plan and the outcome is filled, as always, with the suffering of people who trusted the plan. Was the war for the group or for Rick? I think both are true, and the show is honest about that ambiguity. Rick genuinely wanted to free everyone from Negan's grip. He also wanted to win. He wanted to be the person who ended it. And when you want those two things at the same time, sometimes they're compatible and sometimes they aren't. And sorting out which is which costs people everything. The most honest measure of any leader isn't what they intended. It's what their intentions cost the people who followed them. That accounting, in Seasons 7 and 8, is the heaviest the show ever carries. And we're not done counting yet. Carl Grimes dies in Season 8. He's bitten on a supply run. Trying to help someone. Trying to be the version of the future he believed in. He doesn't make it to the end of the war. He dies in the house where the group sheltered, surrounded by Michonne and Rick, after writing letters he'll never see delivered. After saying the goodbyes that no 17-year-old should have to say. What he leaves behind is a vision. In his letters, in his final conversation with Rick, Carl articulates something the show has been reaching toward for 8 seasons. The idea that the world could be something other than a fight. That there could be communities, cooperation, the possibility of peace. That Negan himself might be capable of being part of a different kind of future. Carl had talked to Siddiq, the stranger Rick had forbidden him to bring into the group, and seen in that interaction something his father had stopped being able to access. The possibility that not everyone is a threat. Rick reads Carl's words and something shifts. The war continues, but its ending changes. Instead of killing Negan, Rick cuts his throat, and then calls for him to receive medical attention. He honours what Carl asked of him. He chooses mercy in the moment where vengeance would have been easiest, and it costs him Maggie's trust and, in some ways, his own sense of resolution. He doesn't get to finish the war on his terms. He finishes it on his son's. Here's what I find worth sitting with in this. Rick's vision for the future, the thing that drives him through Season 9, through the Bridge Project, through the late arc of his story, is Carl's vision, not his own. He's carrying his dead son's dream forward and calling it leadership. But is it? Is following a 17-year-old's last wish the same as having a vision? Or is it a way of staying close to Carl? of keeping something of him alive in the decisions Rick makes each day. I'm not suggesting it's hollow. The impulse is profoundly human and deeply loving. When we lose someone, we often try to continue what they stood for. It's a way of honouring them, of making their death mean something beyond the grief. Rick honouring Carl's vision is real and moving, but it's also worth noticing that, for the last stretch of his main arc, his moral framework belongs to his son. The man who once operated on pure survival instinct is now operating on inherited hope. The letter, as an object, matters here. It's a piece of paper, fragile, mortal, impermanent, and yet it carries more weight than any weapon Rick ever held. It changes his mind in a way that no argument, no threat, no defeat ever managed to, because it comes from Carl, and because Carl is gone. The dead speak to Rick in ways the living often can't reach him. That phone from season 3 is still ringing in a way. Rick has always heard the dead more clearly than the living. He talked to Laurie's ghost. He honoured Shane's ghost by becoming, over time, a version of the ruthless pragmatist Shane always was. And now he's living inside Carl's ghost, carrying his son's hope forward as if it were his own. There's beauty in that. But there's also a kind of displacement. A question about whether Rick has ever fully occupied his own vision, or whether he's always inhabited someone else's. Is Rick following Carl's dream or hiding inside it? I think he might be doing both, and I think the show knows that and respects it, and lets the ambiguity live. Because The Walking Dead has always understood that survivors don't get to be complete people. They get to be the pieces that survival left behind. And sometimes they fill in the missing pieces with the ghosts of the people they loved most. Carl's letters were distributed after his death, to Negan, to the communities, to Rick. Each one a different request, a different hope. But the one Rick received was the one that mattered most, the one that asked him to try to be something like the man he was before all of this. Whether he succeeded is something we're going to keep exploring, and that's where the pattern starts to click. Or at least it might. Let's step back from Rick's own story for a moment and look at what happens in the Walking Dead universe after he's gone. Or rather, what the franchise quietly starts doing with the question of leadership once Rick's specific model is no longer the centre of gravity. Fear the Walking Dead gives us Madison Clark. And Madison is, I'd argue, the closest the franchise comes to a direct parallel to Rick, written with enough narrative distance to be examined more critically. Madison builds communities. She protects the people she loves with ferocious intensity. She makes hard calls that the people around her sometimes can't follow. She lies, she manoeuvres, she puts survival above transparency, and she pays for it in relationships, in trust, in the specific kind of loneliness that comes when the people who need your protection don't know what you're actually doing to provide it. Madison also dies for a community. Or at least that's how her arc originally ends. She locks herself inside a stadium full of walkers to give her people time to escape. It's a sacrifice that reads as heroic in the moment, but is also the culmination of a pattern. Madison took on the entire burden herself, as Rick did, and it consumed her. The community she loved survived her. She didn't survive her community. The show's later seasons complicated her arc considerably by reversing course on her death, but the original shape of it remains meaningful. A leader who loved fiercely, protected recklessly, and burned out. Sound familiar? Dead City takes us somewhere different. Maggie and Negan, two people who couldn't be farther apart on the moral spectrum in Season 7, are now operating in something close to partnership. And what's fascinating about their dynamic is how thoroughly it reframes the hero and villain binary that Rick's story ran on for years. Negan, as a travelling companion and occasional reluctant ally, is shown to be capable of genuine care, genuine cost, genuine grief. He's not redeemed cheaply. The show doesn't pretend his past is forgivable, but it insists he's more than his worst act. And Maggie, carrying Glenn's death in every choice she makes, has become a leader whose moral complexity rivals Rick's at his most complicated. But without the mythology, she doesn't have a badge, she doesn't have seasons of being the protagonist. She's just someone who survived and kept making calls, and the show trusts her to be complicated without apologising for it. And then there's Daryl Dixon in France, separated from everything he knows, navigating a foreign language and a foreign conflict, is, I think, the franchise's quiet answer to what leadership looks like without the performance of it. Daryl has always been the person who did the unglamorous work, supply runs, tracking, perimeter checks, the labour of keeping people alive that doesn't look impressive in a speech. He was never positioned as the hero in Rick's group. He was positioned as the indispensable one, which is a different thing entirely. And in France, without Rick's shadow, without a title, he builds connections and protects people through consistency rather than declaration. The pattern across these spin-offs is worth naming clearly, even though it's my read rather than a confirmed showrunner statement. Every post-Rick story in this universe revisits the question of what good leadership looks like, and every one of them arrives at a version that's more distributed, more costly, more honest about its limits. The singular hero model, one person, one plan, one vision, keeps getting tested in the spin-offs and found wanting. Communities that survive tend to do so because multiple people share the burden, rather than because one person carries it all. Is the franchise slowly admitting something the original show couldn't say out loud while Rick was still the protagonist? I think it might be. Not through any dramatic declaration. The Walking Dead has never been loud about its thesis. But in the accumulation of stories, in the choices made about which leaders survive and which ones break, there's a quiet argument forming. That the problem was never the world. The problem was always the model. One person, responsible for everyone, deciding for everyone. It's a model built for crisis management and badly suited for anything that lasts. And the franchise keeps showing us, gently, what happens when people try it anyway. In early 2024, the Walking Dead universe gave us something many fans had waited years for. Rick Grimes back on screen in The Ones Who Live. And what the miniseries gives us is genuinely fascinating. Not as a triumphant return, but as a quiet interrogation. What has Rick become in the years since the bridge? What has survival cost him this time? And perhaps most interestingly, who has to come and save him? When we find Rick inside the CRM, the Civic Republic Military, the vast and secretive organisation that took him after the bridge explosion in Season 9, he has built a life inside a structure he doesn't control. He's a soldier. He has a rank and a role and a place in an enormous machine. He's not the leader. He's a member of someone else's hierarchy. And it has been wearing him down for years. He's also been trying to escape. Repeatedly. The show reveals that Rick has made attempt after attempt to get back to Michonne, to his family, to the life the bridge interrupted. And every time, the CRM has pulled him back in, with quiet reminders of what happens to people who leave, and the people they love. So he's trapped, not just by physical constraint, but by the threat that leaving would put everyone he cares about in danger. It's a familiar shape, actually. Rick making himself a prisoner to protect the people he loves. And then Michonne finds him. She walks into the CRM's orbit and works her way toward him, carrying years of grief and determination, and the stubborn refusal to accept that he's gone. She rescues him, not just metaphorically. She actually rescues him because Rick has been going numb inside the CRM. He's been adapting, coping, surviving in a place that requires him to set aside the values he once held. Michonne is the thing that pulls him back to himself. When the moment of choice comes, whether to stay and oppose the CRM's campaign of destruction, or to leave with Michonne and find their family, Rick chooses Michonne. He chooses the personal over the collective. He chooses love over mission. And the show frames this as an act of grace rather than selfishness. After everything, the bridge, the years of captivity, the long, slow erosion of who he was, Rick choosing his family feels like the most human thing he's done in a very long time. But here's where the theory becomes interesting. In The Ones Who Live, Rick's heroism is almost entirely reactive. He doesn't drive the plot toward its resolution. Michonne does. He had been trying to survive within the CRM structure, waiting for a window that wasn't coming. It takes someone who loves him showing up from the outside to break the pattern. The hero, it turns out, needed rescuing. Physically, yes, but also from the habit of adapting to power rather than challenging it. Some fans have read The Ones Who Live as a redemption story. Rick finally gets free, finally chooses love, finally escapes the machine. Others have read it as something quieter. An acknowledgement that Rick's particular model of heroism, singular and self-sufficient, was never really what saved him. What saved him was Michonne. What saves most people in this universe is someone else. The found family. The person who refuses to stop looking, not the lone wolf. If Rick needed saving, physically, morally, emotionally, what does that mean for everyone he saved? Maybe it means they were always also saving him. Maybe every person he protected was also, in their protection, keeping him tethered to the version of himself worth protecting. Without the group, without Carl, without Michonne, what would Rick Grimes be? The CRM arc gives us a glimpse. A soldier in someone else's war, keeping his head down, going through the motions of survival without anything underneath it. Worth surviving for. That's not the man who woke up in that hospital. That's what survival becomes when it isn't anchored to love. And maybe that's the quietest thing The Ones Who Live is saying. That the question was never whether Rick was a hero. The question was always whether he could accept being someone who needed to be loved, not just someone who led. Back in the Walking Dead comics by Robert Kirkman, Rick Grimes loses his right hand. The governor cuts it off during the prison arc, a defining physical subtraction that reshapes how Rick exists in that world. He loses his grip, literally and symbolically, and spends years adapting to a world he can no longer hold the same way. In the television series, this doesn't happen. Rick keeps his right hand throughout his entire run. The showrunners have spoken about that decision, practical filming concerns, the visual effect challenges of the time, but the narrative consequence is genuinely meaningful. On television, Rick never loses his grip, and that distinction between the comic and the show opens up a thread worth following. The motif of the right hand runs through the television series anyway, even without the amputation. It's the hand that holds the Colt Python. It's the hand that bites out Joe's throat. It's the hand that reaches for Carl, for Judith, for Michonne. It's the hand that waves people forward and points guns at Alexandrians and presses a walker's head down when there are no words left. The right hand in this story is the physical language of Rick's authority. When it moves, something changes. What I find theoretically interesting, and I want to be clear, this is my reading, not a showrunner confirmation. is that the arc of Rick's right hand maps onto the arc of his leadership. In the early seasons, it's confident. It draws, it commands, it acts without hesitation that grows shorter each season. By the end of his main arc in Season 9, the hand that detonates the bridge is also the hand that removes him from the story. The thing that saved his family destroys his life with them, in the same gesture. And inside the CRM, in The Ones Who Live, we see his hand doing what the institution requires, operating weapons for someone else's war, serving someone else's vision. The grip that once held his own plan now serves another's. In the comics, losing the hand is the physical reckoning, the universe forcing Rick to confront his dependence on force, on control, on the specific weapon that marked him as dangerous. On television, the show finds other ways to take that grip away. Through Carl's death, through the bridge, through the CRM. The losses differ in form but not in function. The show keeps asking, one way or another, what happens when the man with the plan loses the thing that gave his plan force? There's a question that lives at the centre of this entire theory, and this chapter is circling it directly. His arc was always about learning to lead without controlling. Learning to be part of a structure rather than the top of one. Learning to let the people beside him do the things his hands couldn't, or shouldn't. Did he learn it? The evidence is genuinely open. The Ones Who Live suggests yes. He chooses Michonne over the mission, love over grip. But it also shows us a man who had to be extracted from the machine before he could make that choice. The learning wasn't smooth or internal. It was pulled out of him by circumstance and love, the same way everything important always has been. An open hand or a closed fist? Which one built the world that survived? I think the honest answer is neither. Alone. The communities that endure in this universe, and some of them do endure, we see it in the later spin-offs, are built by people with open hands and closed fists working alongside each other, arguing, losing each other, trying again. Rick was one instrument in that, a significant one, maybe even an irreplaceable one at certain moments, but one instrument, not the orchestra. The right hand at the end of all of this is just a hand, not a weapon, not a symbol of authority, not a claim staked on a world he was never fully able to hold, just the thing that reaches toward the people you love and hopes, quietly, that they'll still be there to reach back. And maybe that's where the theory was always pointing. Not toward a verdict, but toward a recognition. The hand doesn't have to be a fist to matter. It just has to be open. If you take Rick out of the centre of the Walking Dead story, not erase him, just shift him gently to one side, something interesting comes into focus. All the people who are standing around him, holding things up, quietly without credit, without the camera staying on their faces long enough. Carol Pelletier. Let's start there because Carol's arc is one of the most complete and quietly remarkable transformations the franchise ever put on screen. She begins as a frightened woman who made herself invisible, who deferred to everyone, who couldn't quite believe she had value beyond what others assigned to her. And she becomes, gradually, through loss and violence and grief and deliberate choice, one of the most capable and emotionally complex survivors in the entire story. She survives not because she arrived with authority, but because she refused to stay small. Every hard call she makes, every sacrifice, every cookie she bakes as a cover for something more dangerous underneath. It's all Carol, choosing to keep going on her own terms. Nobody gave her permission to become who she became. She just did it, in the gaps Rick left. Michonne. Introduced in Season 3 as a walking mystery, Michonne doesn't explain herself and doesn't ask permission. She carries a katana and survives in ways that make the group uncomfortable until they stop being able to ignore how necessary she is. Her loyalty, once given, is profound and unconditional. Her judgment, particularly in the later seasons, is often clearer than Rick's, and she knows when to push back and when to hold the line. She is, by many measures, the emotional and moral anchor of the group's later years. And her story in The Ones Who Live shows us what she became in Rick's absence. Not smaller, not diminished, but relentless. The person who crossed the world because she refused to accept the ending she'd been handed. Daryl Dixon. We've talked about Daryl as the person who does unglamorous work. Supply runs, tracking, perimeter checks, the labour of survival that doesn't look heroic from a distance, but holds everything together up close. His arc is also about belonging, a man who spent his entire pre-apocalypse life feeling disposable and outside, finding a found family that chose him and choosing them back. His loyalty to Rick is real and deep. But in France, without Rick's shadow, without the title, he finds his way, he protects people, he builds something, and he does it through consistency rather than declaration, the same way he always has. Maggie Rhee, Glenn's partner, Herschel's daughter, the leader of the hilltop through some of its darkest hours. And in Dead City, still carrying all of it while navigating a Manhattan that has become its own kind of wilderness. Maggie's leadership is earned in the most painful way imaginable, through a loss that breaks you, and then a choice, made again and again, to keep going anyway. She didn't inherit leadership, she didn't default into it. She built it, decision by decision, in the shadow of a grief she has never fully set down. Siddiq and Father Gabriel represent something different, the emotional and spiritual labour that communities need to actually function over time. Siddiq, a medical student Carl died to bring into the group, became the doctor, the memory keeper, the one who told the story of what happened so it wouldn't be lost. Gabriel, who began as a coward, locked inside a church, and became the man who kept Alexandria's council honest, represents the long arc of chosen courage, the kind that doesn't arrive whole, but has to be rebuilt after every collapse. These people, and so many others, Herschel and Beth and Abraham and Rosita and Aaron and Eugene, are the actual bones of what the group built and rebuilt across 8 seasons and beyond. Rick was the face of it, the voice of it, the name that history would attach to it. But the structure was assembled by all of them, through all their losses and choices and stubborn refusals to quit. The show's title is plural, The Walking Dead, not the hero's journey, not the man who led them, plural. And I don't think that's accidental. I think the show always knew, from the very beginning, that the real protagonist was the group, the collective, the found family. Rick was the lens we used to see them, but they were the story all along. What if the show always knew that and just waited for us to figure it out? Let's go back to the beginning. Rick Grimes at a sink, washing blood from his hands. It's early in season 3, after something the world required of him. He stares at his hands, the water runs red, then pink, then clear, and there's a look on his face. Not guilt exactly, not pride exactly. Something more complicated and more honest than either of those. Something like recognition. Like a man watching himself in a mirror for the first time in a long time, and not entirely knowing the reflection looking back. We started there because it felt significant. A small moment, easy to miss. A man cleaning up after the world demanded something of him, the way the world always demands something. And throughout everything we've walked through tonight, the badge and the phone and the war and the letter, and the right hand and the people holding things up in his shadow, that image has been waiting for us to come back to it. Here's what it looks like now, with everything we've carried with us. Rick washing his hands isn't only guilt. It's the ongoing practice of a man trying to reconcile who he was with what survival required. Every time he stands at that sink, he's trying to get clean again, trying to find the version of himself that predates all the choices, the deaths, the moments where he picked necessity over mercy. He never quite gets there. The water runs clear eventually, but something stays. Something the water can't reach. Something that travels forward with him into every community, every war, every goodbye. And that's the cost. Not just Rick's cost, the cost of the model. The idea that one person can carry the weight of everyone else's survival, can be the line between order and chaos, can make the decisions that keep the group alive. It works for a while. It has to work because the alternative is no line at all. But it changes the person who holds the line. It always does. And the people behind the line, Carol and Daryl and Michonne and Maggie and all the rest, they watch it happen and they fill the gaps and they keep going. The right hand at the end of everything we've explored is open. Not grasping, not pointing, not wrapped around a weapon. Just open, Rick on the bridge, just before the explosion. Arms spread, eyes on Michonne, on the world he's trying to give a chance it might not deserve. It's not triumphant. It's a surrender of a specific kind, the surrender of the need to control the outcome. He can't. He never could. He just took longer than most to fully understand that. I'm not your governor. I'm not the governor of anything. He said it like a refusal. We said at the beginning of tonight that it might actually be an admission. And sitting here now, on the other side of all of it, I still believe that. Not an admission of failure. Nothing as simple or as final as that. An admission of something more true. That leadership in this world was never about governance. It was about love, about showing up, about choosing the people beside you over the idea of yourself as the one in charge. Rick got there. He got there slowly and painfully, and at great cost to everyone around him. But he got there. Was Rick Grimes the hero of The Walking Dead? My honest answer after all of this is, I don't think the show was ever telling that story. I think it was telling a story about what happens when we need one person to be the hero. When we outsource our hope and our moral weight to a single figure and wait for them to carry it all. And the show's answer, stretched across seasons and spin-offs and years of earned complication is, it costs too much. For them. For us. For everyone who stood in the shadow and did the work without the credit and loved him anyway. The man at the sink is just a man. Tired, complicated, trying to stay clean in a world that won't let anyone stay clean for long. The badge is still in his pocket. The right hand is wet. The water runs clear eventually. Maybe that's not the tragedy. Maybe it's the most human thing the show ever gave us. Not a hero, just a person trying. Held up without always knowing it by the people who loved him enough to stay. If Rick was never the hero, does it make the story less worth telling? I don't think so. I think it makes it more